Hello, I'm Robert Byrne, and today we're going to talk about the beginning of World War One. To start with the quote from Otto von Bismarck in 1888, "One day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans." Now, Bismarck was the first Chancellor of Germany, and he is kind of the dominant figure in European politics from the middle of the 1800s to 1890, when he was forced to resign. He's known as the father of realpolitik, the political philosophy, and he very much shaped Europe what it was leading into the 20th century. However, he did heavily fear that the politicians after him would not exactly keep the legacy he left behind, and he feared disastrous war and especially the collapse of a Germany that he helped build. Now, when you talk about World War One in an academic sense, you typically look at the main model. So first is militarism. The overall culture at the time in Europe was very militaristic. Technology and industrial might was improving, and this led to arms races. The most famous would be the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. However, the overall consensus was that Britain was still the dominant naval power and Germany was the dominant land power. Militarism was also popular not just with the governments, but also the people, because you have all these jobs that come about from building ships and weapons. It becomes really popular economically with the average person. Now, the biggest issue with militarism that I think is ignored is that it's ignorant militarism. Many of the great military minds of the 1800s had either passed away or kind of been too old and retired, and many of the new minds kind of ignored a lot of red flags about how modern war would be fought. The U.S. Civil War, the Russo-Japanese War, and other kind of some colonial conflicts, especially in Africa, were kind of ignored by a lot of the European military brass. And if they would have paid more attention to these conflicts, they could have foreseen a lot more about how World War One would actually be fought. Second is the alliance system, the A. Ironically, Bismarck's time, they set the alliance system as almost a kind of mutually assured destruction before nuclear weapons existed, to kind of force an interconnected web of alliances that would ensure kind of a peace state. However, didn't really work this way, and especially after Bismarck, you see a great shift in alliances at a very rapid rate. Germany and Russia were allied, and then against Austria. Then Germany, Austria, and Russia were allied, and then Germany and Russia split, and so Germany and Austria remained friends, and then Russia and France became friends. This alliance network kept kind of changing, but then when you get to the 20th century, you get the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance. Famously, the Triple Alliance is Italy, Austria, and Germany, even though Italy will end up not joining the war on their side. And the Triple Entente was Russia, France, and Britain, and these kind of were the settling major powers of what the Great War would end up becoming. The I in main is imperialism. The later half of the 1800s sees a new age of imperialism. You get the European powers, and you also get the United States and Japan begin expanding their imperial domain. Africa becomes colonized. East Asia gets kind of split into different spheres of influence. You especially see that in China. This led to a lot of conflicts and even near breakouts of a world war early. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904 was a result of imperial ambitions between the Japanese and Russia over Chinese territory. And it ended up a huge Russian embarrassment when they lost, and that kind of damaged their imperial prestige, which led them to be even more militaristic. The eventual assassination that causes World War One even comes about because Austrian imperialism led them to annex Bosnia in 1908, which would become the great area of contention over Serbs and the Austrian government. And the Great War almost sparked nearly way earlier because of the first Moroccan crisis in 1905 and the second Moroccan crisis in 1911, as Germany, Spain, France, and Britain kind of bickered over who would have influence over Moroccan land. And in the end, imperialism was so critical to the economies of the great powers, and it continued to feed into the other elements of Maine, that it really spiraled, and it could have easily been some other colonial conflict if the assassination in Sarajevo did not start the Great War first. The final part of Maine, the end, is nationalism. Nationalism had been center stage kind of since the age of Napoleon, is when it really started to spur on. You see a lot of revolutions in 1848. However, in the 20th century, you kind of get two types of nationalism really showing through. There's the nationalism of power prestige and the nationalism of uniting peoples. Power prestige nationalism is more like the European powers, the strong cultural pride, the animosity to other nations that they kind of see as rivals. And the nationalism of uniting peoples is something more like the plight of the Irish, the plight of the Serbians trying to unite their fellow Serbs together with them into a greater Serbia, or the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire wanting to be a nation of their own. So, on June 28th, 1914, Bismarck's correction, Bismarck was proven correct with his prediction that the Balkans would end up causing a great European war, as Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo and Bosnia, which was controlled by Austria. Ironically, the choice to kill Franz Ferdinand is kind of a bad one on the half of the Serbian nationalists, because he was a figure who was very pro-plight of the Serbians in a way. He was very liberal at the time, and he was probably the most likely political figure to kind of bring some sort of peaceful solution between the two. But a lot of people don't realize it's like, oh, he's dead. Okay, the war starts right away. But it was actually a whole month that led up to it. So he dies on June 28th, and then you get the blank check that Germany gives to Austria on July 6th, assuring them that they'll back them as an ally. But then you don't get to almost a month later, July 23rd, where Serbia gets the ultimatum. And exactly a month later, Austria declares war on July 28th after Serbia refuses. And then Russia was the first kind of to mobilize and be ready. And then by August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany declares war on France. August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany for invading Belgium. So even though the Archduke dies on June 28th, there's all this time and all these little events that could have changed and been different. But even if they don't, war is still probably inevitable. There's still a great war that likely comes out. But I think it's still important to consider that if there's a war that starts later or under different circumstances, it could have drastically changed the outcome of the war. And I think that in itself is very important, that all these little details over the span of a little over a month was what really solidified the First World War. Now, on the topic of who caused the Great War, I don't think there is an answer. The blame game is really easy to play, and you can kind of blame anyone. And John Green kind of has a bit that I really like, where he traces the blame game all the way back to Julius Caesar, and he goes, no wonder Caesar was assassinated. He was about to start World War I in 1900 years. And I think academia largely has placed the blame on Germany, and I think that is also a very highly British-biased kind of academia. But I think the main model and kind of looking at how complicated the lead-up to the war was should show us that there's not really any direct one person to blame. And I think that that kind of history has been largely ignored and just saying, oh, Germany or somebody else caused it. And to end, I would kind of want to just go back to Bismarck. Kind of a Nostradamus himself. He had a lot of predictions that came true, so let's finish with one more. In his last meeting with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who fired him, he told him that when his remaining staff was gone, he would truly fail. And on his deathbed on July 30th, 1898, he claimed the German Empire would fall 20 years after his death. Lo and behold, 20 years later, in 1918, only 3 or 4 months after the date of his death, the official surrender of Germany took place. The Kaiser was no longer in power, and the German Empire saw its formal end.